Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from Capital One Bank and Perfect Building Maintenance, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Cushman and Wakefield, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, New York Community Bank, Bank of America, Kilroy Metal Products, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Essex Capital Partners, Excel Realty Advisors, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, First Service Williams, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Helmsley Spear, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Madison Realty Capital, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sterling and Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the Moynihan Group.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller. You know, New York City, everybody loves food, hospitality, and there are people who have really created in New York the restaurants, the atmosphere, the environment, and you know, today I'm so lucky to have Daniel Meyer, who is the CEO of Union Square Hospitality.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Danny. So, Danny, you know, I think when this show airs, you're going to be 51 at that time. So you'll be 51, and you grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And when you were growing up, you said to me you had a couple of things that you loved: sports, occasionally spending some time at the racetrack, playing piano, and loving jazz, right?
And cooking.
And cooking, you know. And part of that was because of your dad. Tell me a little bit about your dad and his travel business.
My dad was a bon vivant. He and my mom spent the first 2 years of their marriage in France, on the border of France and Germany, because my dad was stationed as a counterintelligence officer in the U.S. Army. There weren't a whole lot of conflicts back then, and so they spent probably most of their time eating in people's homes and occasionally going into small restaurants and country inns. And he came back to St. Louis, Missouri, started a travel agency, and as a hobby on the side, this was a traditional travel agency back then where they made their money by making a percentage of, you know, airline ticket sales. Right, yeah. But on the side, as a hobby, he would design driving tours for his friends throughout the French countryside, stopping at these little inns, these mom and pop inns. And soon so many people started to ask him about it that he created a business called Open Road Tours. And he then became the first agent for the Relais de Campagne, which became Relais and Chateau.
Which later on in our show will have an interesting story, right?
And we always had young French people living in our home from that point on, because they would do double duty. They would be babysitters for us by night, and they would work in my dad's office to translate his business. And so there was always great food on the table, always a bottle of Beaujolais on the table. And I had the privilege of just growing up in a natural way around good food.
And you said, you know, when you were growing up, you went to public school, then private school, and you know, you loved sports. You loved all the St. Louis teams, the Cardinals, the Blues, all the teams, and you used to play piano. And then really what happens is this is the time of the Vietnam War. You know, this was influence. It had some influence on your life, you said.
I grew up in an interesting time. It was primarily the 1960s and early 70s, definitely the time of Vietnam and Richard Nixon, etc. And I also grew up as the middle child in a family where my dad's family were arch Republicans from St. Louis, no pun intended on the arch. And my mom's side of the family were staunch Democrats from Chicago, North Shore of Chicago. And I had a very, very close friendship almost with my father, even though my politics ended up being completely connected to my mom.
So now the kid from St. Louis decides, because you had visited New York a little bit when you were young, you decide to go to Trinity College.
Trinity College was the only college that decided to accept me, maybe more to the point. I was never so humiliated as the day that the envelopes came and I had been rejected from Princeton, where both my father and his father had gone, and simply waitlisted at Trinity. And shame on me for not having cast a wider net. But Trinity took me off the wait list, and I felt determined to prove that I could be a good student. First thing I did was wanting to get into your business. I signed up to be the news director for the college radio station, and then I became a jazz DJ, and I became a political science major.
But you really enjoyed your life at Trinity, and you had the great opportunity because of your dad's businesses that you were able to travel around the world. I mean, a lot to Europe mostly. I mean, you were telling me that you were able to take Pan Am, it's like an unknown name, Pan Am they wouldn't remember, for $48.
Maybe one of the reasons the airline went out of business is because of that deal, but because of my dad's business, until I hit the age of 21, I was able to travel for $48 round trip. So on any number of weekends, whenever there was a long weekend, a 3 or 4 day weekend at school, I would take my little VW Rabbit down to JFK and get on Pan Am and go to Rome. And I just had the most amazing education. I also worked for my dad as a tour guide because by this point, his company was selling package tours. And by the time my sister and I and my brother would each turn 20.
So you were like the Mario Perillo of the St. Louis market?
Well, my dad was in a certain way, and I was we all got to be a tour guide, so I picked Rome as a place to be a tour guide. And then later at Trinity College, I went back again because we created a political science program in Trinity's campus in Rome.
You spent time there, right? I remember you telling me. Now, but you love living in New York. I mean, you were in Connecticut, but you love coming to New York City. You love jazz. You love Belmont. I don't know why you didn't like Aqueduct. You said you like Belmont. And you love the restaurants. I mean, but you love the restaurants. St. Louis, I don't know what the restaurants were. Chicago, we know with your mother's side, they always had some good restaurants. But you really love that. And so now what happens is you graduate Trinity as a political science major, not sure what you're planning to do, and you go to Chicago. And you get a job with a TV station, a public broadcasting.
WTTW. My grandfather in Chicago, Irving Harris, had been a major supporter and was very involved with WTTW. And this was the time that I wasn't sure whether I wanted to get into broadcasting or politics. I knew it was somewhere in the middle. And by that time, I had actually worked on a number of political campaigns, both as a volunteer back in St. Louis for Senator Symington,
you said.
His son Jim Symington, who was a congressman, and I had also worked for Jimmy Carter's campaign, and I was completely disillusioned by Carter's presidency. And so by the time I got to Chicago, I had become enamored with a politician named John Anderson, who had been running as a Republican, got trounced by Reagan, and now would run as an independent. First job I got was at WTTW to be a production assistant for John Calloway's political TV show. And then I got offered the job.
5:30 in the morning show, right?
I got offered 2 jobs in one day. One was the local NBC affiliate, as part of its public service, had to have a 4 a.m. TV show on Sunday mornings, which they offered me. Thought that would be a big break for me. On the same day, I was offered the opportunity to be John Anderson's Cook County field coordinator for his presidential campaign.
Which probably, as we were saying before, which helped that you in your books, really cultivated of how you really dealt with people, how people to learn to work, because anyone who worked in this political campaign did it because they loved it, not because of the money.
Well, nobody was getting paid anything. I was getting $214 a week as the boss. The 22 people who reported to me, which was the first time I ever had anyone report to me, were all volunteers. And I think I learned probably the key managerial leadership lesson of my life right then, which is that when you have nothing to motivate people with except an ideal, that needs to be the primary thing you have. And so even today, where people do get a paycheck, I've got to give people in my restaurants a reason to want to work for us over and beyond their paycheck.
So now, but as you said, the political campaign wasn't that good. And he got 7.5% of the vote?
Well, 7.5 meant that he got matching funds, which meant I got my last paycheck.
Right,
so it wasn't that bad.
You got your $214, but at this time you said, you know what, go east, right? It was not go west. You said, I want to come back to the Big Apple.
Yeah,
you know?
I had never lost this taste of New York that I'd gotten from my weekends, you know, my weekend road trips while I was at Trinity. And so I got a job once again through my grandfather, who had invested in a company that sold electronic tags to stop shoplifters.
Right, but before that, you mentioned how you came here. You came over here and you lived on the floor of this apartment on First Avenue.
Well, that's
right?
what everybody does.
Yeah, of course.
Before you can get an apartment, the first thing you have to do is move in with your college friends. And some good friends allowed me to sleep on the floor for 2 weeks.
So you slept on the floor and you got this job with the sensor company.
Called Checkpoint Systems. And the guy who, and I was the special projects manager, and now I know as an employer that that's the name that you give someone when you don't really have a name for what they do. They'd probably given me this job as a favor. But lo and behold, within about a month and a half, the New York account manager resigned to go to the competition, and I inherited the whole New York territory.
Danny Meyer, the Trinity guy, you know, who was the political guy over there in Chicago, is now, you know, I don't want to say, he's selling sensors to be put on, you know, items in Duane Reade and in, you know, the
Burlington Coat
Factory, you know,
ShopRite,
all the places. So, you know, the noise would go off. Beep, 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 beep. So this is what Danny Meyer...
This is what my life had come to.
Your life had come to. You got a new apartment also at this time. You know, and you said, you know, it was an interesting time because you were a good salesman.
Well, I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about New York City. They gave me a company car. Again, I was the only salesman who begged to have a Volkswagen Rabbit. Everybody else wanted the big fancy car. And I drove everywhere. I got to make my own schedule.
Right, you had Westchester also, you said.
I had Westchester, Suffolk, Putnam, Nassau County. I had New Jersey. And I learned every single neighborhood in the city. I learned more about the bad neighborhoods than anywhere else, wherever I had the highest cases of shoplifting.
And you also had the opportunity to go to eat, which you always loved. You relished, you know, going for good food and good wine.
Sometimes my idea of good food and wine would be a Greek diner on Long Island. Sometimes it would be Popeye's Fried Chicken. Sometimes it would be Junior's Deli in Brooklyn. But the point was,
Don't knock Junior's Deli.
I'm not knocking anything. I would actually...
The best cheesecake around.
I would make my entire sales schedule based on where I wanted to be at lunch that day. I had to make the most of this. I'll never forget a day that I was doing business in Williamsburg. And
that's before it was chic.
It was well before it was chic, and I couldn't figure out how to get back on the bridge. And I rolled down my window, and there was a Hasidic Jewish gentleman carrying a bag of matzahs. And I asked him where the matzah factory was. And he says, if you let me come in your car, I'll take you there. So I'm driving around, the St. Louis Jew that I am, with a Hasidic Jew with a pack of matzahs and my little baby blue rabbit. It was quite a sight to behold.
So now what happens is you say to yourself, you know, what am I going to do, right?
That's exactly what I said to myself.
You said, what am I going to do?
I said, what happened to the journalism degree? What happened to the politics? What am I going to do here?
And I think it's the story that you told me that you were going to take your LSATs. You wanted to become a lawyer.
Well, I decided that I was going to cast my lot with politics and not with journalism. And that I really cared about issues. I really did. And that the path to becoming a politician was first to become a lawyer. So I took the Stanley Kaplan course in taking your LSATs. I was all ready to go, and literally on the eve of taking the LSAT.
You were having dinner with your aunt and uncle.
At Elio's on the Upper East Side. And I had the worst time. I was depressed. Everybody else was having a great time drinking wine. And my uncle looks at me and he says, why are you so down in the dumps? And I said, because I don't want to be a lawyer. And he said, of course you don't. Why don't you just do what you've been talking about your whole life? And I said, what? And he said, Danny, all I've ever heard you talk about is restaurants. And I still didn't get it. I said, so? He said, why don't you open a restaurant? And I have to acknowledge that it had never dawned on me that that would be a credible and legitimate and acceptable career path.
When we tell everybody what you own, what Union Square Hospitality owns, which I failed to, but I will. I mean, here, now, this guy who was thinking of becoming a politician, going into law school, then decides to go to this restaurant school on 34th Street, near Macy's or Gimbel's over there at that time, the New York Restaurant School.
Yeah, it was right down the street from your studio.
And you had a friend who worked for U.S. Trust at that time, and the two of you were going to take the course.
Right. Connor Seabrook was one of my best friends from Trinity, and I thought he could be the money guy, I could be the food guy. And he went in for it. So we took the first 2 classes, and then he gave me a call the next morning, and he said, I can't do this. I got to go to business school. So he ends up going to Dartmouth Business School. But he felt so badly that he introduced me to the one bank client that U.S. Trust had at the time, which was a seafood restaurant called Pesca on 22nd Street. And they got me an interview, and I got hired. Big raise, $250 a week this time. Significant drop from the money I was making as a salesman of electronic tags, but I had decided a long time ago I didn't want to be catching shoplifters for a living.
So what happens now is you get a job for about, what is it, 6 or 7 months at Pesca?
Yep.
And you're the assistant manager. Fortunately, you weren't cooking at that time, as we joked about the cooking, which we'll talk about later on. And you had that desire, and then you decide that you really want a little more experience, so you go, what do? You go to Europe.
The only legitimate way I could imagine telling my parents that I was going to be parlaying a great high school and college education.
Parlaying, just like the horses.
Just like the horse races, was if I would do it through the kitchen door, because even at that point in the 1980s, we were starting to see some well-educated people become chefs, and it certainly wasn't the day of the Food Network or anything like that, but it was starting to become legitimate. So I decided I would go learn to cook professionally. And my dad helped me get 2 jobs in Bordeaux with some of his Relais and Chateau friends. And I got to work with some of the family-run trattorias that I'd gotten to know when I was working as a tour guide in Rome. And I spent almost 90 days. I learned a whole lot about cooking. And I spent the entire time dreaming about this restaurant I would want to open, which would later become Union Square Cafe.
But we'll get to that, because I think it's interesting. So you come back from Europe, and then it's the decision of where's Danny Meyer going to find his first restaurant? What kind of restaurant is this? And you're walking through the city back and forth, right? And subsequently, you meet a woman who was with Newmark and Company, and she said, Danny, what'd she say to you about this neighborhood?
This is a woman named Ellen Giddens, and I went to college with her son Paul. She was a leading real estate person at the time here in Manhattan, and she said, you really should take seriously this neighborhood that they're starting to call the Flatiron District. This is where all the ad firms are going to escape the expensive midtown rents. And she was right, because back then there was Ammirati and Puris and Gere Dubois and Margiotta, Fertitta, a huge number of ad firms. I'm sure I'm missing 3 or 4. She said there's also a lot of publishers. Harry Abrams is there, Ferris Strasser was there. And she said they do not have a place to go.
So what happens? You find this restaurant called Brownies, a vegetarian restaurant?
Right.
Brownies?
Brownies had been on 21 East 16th Street for 49 years at that point. It had been the first vegetarian restaurant in the city. And what I liked best about it was that it was a stone's throw from New York's really first green market on Union Square. At that time, it was only 2 days a week, unlike today's 4 days a week. But the time I had spent in France working with chefs had really shown me that when you can shop for your food at the market, you're at a big advantage.
So what happens is you go to Brownies once, and then you finally say, you finally meet the owner, right?
Well, I made a cold call, and I asked the cashier in the front of the restaurant if I could meet the owner. And he said, why? And I said, I just want to find out if he would ever sell his restaurant. I mean, I can't believe I asked that question. And
especially we're 25 at this time.
I was 26. I don't think I would have asked the question at 36 at this time. But in fact, I think there's a word for that. But the guy said, let me just take your card. So he took my card.
And then you get the phone call later
And I got
on.
a phone call about a week later saying that the owner, Sam Brown, would like to meet me. And we had a nice conversation. It turned out that he was, he was not incredibly well. He had a severe asthma. And to make a long story short, I bought the last 14 years of a 20-year lease.
At $8 a foot.
$8 a square foot. And I know that sounds incredibly low today, but in 1985, Union Square Park was much better known for needles than herbs.
So now Danny Meyer takes over this Brownies, this vegetarian restaurant, and how, we were talking how you created the name Union Square. You spoke to your dad.
I spoke to my dad because while I was in Europe learning to cook, I had written down all these wonderful names, Piazza dell'Unione, Gorgonzola, Blue Plate Grill, all these awful names. And my dad looked at him and he basically just handed me the piece of paper back. He had actually been the managing editor of the Daily Princetonian, and so I would always have him edit everything of mine. And he said, "Why don't you just call it what it is?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "It's Union Square Cafe." And I said, "I don't want to name it after Union Square. Do you know what Union Square is famous for? There's people getting murdered outside of Andy Warhol's nightclub." And he said, "Trust me, Union Square is the premier real estate address in all of San Francisco, and if you do your job the right way, one day Union Square Cafe will become a very prestigious name."
So you open up Union Square Cafe, what, in October?
October 21, 1985.
And now, there's an interesting story because 3 months later you get 2 stars in the New York Times. But I like that other story about when Arthur Schwartz comes into the restaurant, the former Daily News. What happens on that?
Oh, that was a bad night. I had given, actually, my chef and the sous chef, a woman, I couldn't find them one day, and I searched high and low in the restaurant until I found them making out by the oyster bin in the walk-in refrigerator. And it turned out that they asked to have the first Thanksgiving weekend that we were open, so a month after we opened, if they could go back to her Cleveland home to introduce the chef to her parents. And I figured we weren't all that busy at that point, and Thanksgiving weekend would be slow, so I gave them the time off. And all of a sudden, we just get slammed that night, that Friday night, just as busy as can be. So I threw the chef jacket over my Brooks Brothers suit and tie, and the tie, I was sweating. I hadn't eaten all night. This tie was bleeding all over my shirt. And I hadn't eaten all night, and I walk into the dining room sort of woozy. And I get into the dining room, and there's a guy walking around the dining room with a tie tied around his neck, drunk, asking for another drink. And I told the guy, "You can't have another drink." And he said, "You can't stop me from having another drink." And I said, "But I can make you pay the check." And he said, "You can't make me pay the check." And I go, "But I can make you get out of my restaurant." So we go chest to chest, walking up the stairs. He punches me in the face. I push him out the door. He then slams the door on my head. I then punch him back myself, the only time I ever punched anyone. Lo and behold, who's watching this entire thing? But Arthur Schwartz, the restaurant critic of the Daily News, who the subsequent week gives us our first ever review, says this restaurant has tremendous promise, but I do have to tell you there's some inconsistencies. The first time I had a perfect meal, the timing was great, the food was outstanding, the service was great. The second time, there were lots of ups and downs, including watching the patron getting into a fist fight with one of his customers. Thankfully, it's been uphill from there.
So really the interesting thing, then you decided you wanted to wait a little while, and really it was to 1994. And I think part of that was the fact that you said your dad, your real mentor, was in the travel business, but then he went into the real estate business, and during that period of time he filed for bankruptcy. And that was something that created a little cautious, that the world, you have to be prepared. So in 1994, you're walking again in a different neighborhood. What happens? You decide, you find a place with Meyer on the outside of the building?
Well, it almost goes like that. Because of my dad's business hardships towards the end of his life, and he died in
1990.
Thank you, 1990. I had really told myself, just don't expand. You got a good thing going here with Union Square Cafe. And then one day, because of the recession of 1991, 1992, a number of restaurants were going out of business in New York, and a prominent restaurant called Mondrian, whose chef I loved, a young guy named Tom Colicchio, who's gone on to be a very famous chef, approached me because his restaurant had gone out of business, and he said, "I'd really love to open a place with you." And I was going, okay, I promised myself I'll never open another restaurant. On the other hand, I've got Sandy Koufax asking if he can pitch on my team. What am I going to say, no? So Tom and I decided to do this restaurant together, And we found a building that happened to have the word N.S. Meyer, which it still does to this day. It was an old military uniform warehouse, and we turned it into Gramercy Tavern.
Which has done great. Then we go 2 years fast forward, 1996. You find another park now.
Find another park because I had just loved the opportunity to get involved with the restoration of Union Square Park. And here was Madison Square Park out in the middle of nowhere, but yet right opposite the Flatiron Building, the MetLife Clock Tower, and nobody even knew it was there. It was desolate. And MetLife offered to help take a lead with me to help restore the park if we would put in 2 restaurants right there. So we did 11 Madison Park and Tabla, which opened in 1998.
And then to continue on, I mean, and both of them have been Michelin and everything rated over there. Then you get involved. You always loved jazz, you said to me, right?
Well, my first cousin, James Polsky, the son of my uncle, Richard Polsky, who told me to get in the business, had a passion for jazz. And he had opened a jazz club called the Jazz Standard along with a restaurant upstairs. He was getting a little bit tired of being in the restaurant business, and he asked if we would do something that would preserve the jazz club but would actually go better with it. And that's when I came up with the idea for Blue Smoke. I had always loved barbecue. I didn't see a whole lot of barbecue in the city at the time. And having done all these 3-star restaurants, I said, this time I just want to do something easy like a joint.
With 2 minutes left, I must make sure that I got 2 minutes left to get the others. So then you go Blue Smoke, and then subsequently Museum of Modern Art says, Danny, we need some restaurants.
And art had been a passion of mine from the time I was growing up. My parents, who actually were divorced after 25 years, beyond the mutual love they had for all their kids, just completely adored art. They both were gifted with their eyes for art. My mom had an art gallery when I grew up. She was on the board of the St. Louis Art Museum. And this was one of the greatest days of my life when the Museum of Modern Art offered us the opportunity to create a restaurant as well as visitor cafes within the museum.
And then
we completely devolved and opened Shake Shack.
I mean, out of nowhere. Cheeseburgers, Chicago hot dogs, you know.
And frozen custard shakes.
And frozen custard shakes. So you open up the first Shake Shack at Madison Square Park.
In Madison Square
Park, which everybody, I passed it, as I said to you yesterday, with the wind power, and now you can have solar because I gave you that idea.
That's a fantastic idea.
And then after that, you create Union Square
Hudson Yards Catering.
Hudson Yards Catering.
And Hudson Yards was our opportunity to really take the quality of food and hospitality we have in the restaurants, but do it in everything from people's homes to museums, and now out to Citi Field with the Mets.
Right, and at Citi Field, what are you're opening, we have 30 seconds left. You're opening up 4 different venues?
We're going to try to do what we've done, whether it's museums or jazz clubs or Indian food or barbecue, and say, how can we raise the bar? What can we add to the dialogue? And
no more Harry M. Stevens.
If we can make it more fun to go to the ball game, we're going to sure try to do
Last comment. There are 4 children. Name the 4 children.
I don't remember. Okay. Hallie, Charles, Gretchen, and Peyton. Loves of my life, and my wife Audrey, who's a saint.
So I'd say, Danny, you have truly become a builder of New York in a variety of ways, and you've helped Union Square, Madison Square, and you've helped the palates of people of New York. Thank you for being here today.
I love being a New Yorker.
Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from Capital One Bank and Perfect Building Maintenance, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Cushman & Wakefield, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, New York Community Bank, Bank of America, Kilroy Metal Products, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Investment Fund, Essex Capital Partners, Excel Realty Advisors, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, First Service Williams, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Helmsley Spear, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Madison Realty Capital, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Muss Development, Palin Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sterling and Sterling, Stephen Napolitano, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, the Moynihan Group.